March 19, 1943. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath a pewter sky, its surface heaving with swells that rose and fell like the breathing of some enormous sleeping creature. Somewhere between Greenland and Iceland, in waters so cold that survival time for an unprotected man measured in single-digit minutes, a steel cylinder glided silently through the depths at a depth of 90 meters. Inside that cylinder, 44 men breathed recycled air, thick with the smell of diesel, unwashed bodies, and the particular metallic tang of fear that no amount of bravado could entirely mask. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein stood in the control room of his submarine, one hand gripping the periscope housing for balance as the vessel swayed gently in the underwater currents. At 34 years old, he had already spent more than 3 years commanding submarines in the Atlantic, and his weathered face bore the particular pallor of men who spent months at a time without seeing direct sunlight. His eyes, pale blue and perpetually narrowed from years of peering through periscopes, scanned the depth gauge with the casual competence of a man who had performed this action 10,000 times before. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Hartenstein did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that the technology of undersea detection had undergone a revolution in the 18 months since his last encounter with Allied escort vessels. The cat-and-mouse game he believed he was playing operated under rules that had fundamentally changed, and the confidence that had served him well through dozens of successful patrols was about to become his greatest liability. This is the story of how technological innovation transformed the Atlantic conflict virtually overnight, and how one captain's certainty in his own invisibility led to one of the most dramatic reversals in naval history. The morning had begun promisingly enough. At 0600 hours, the radio operator, a young man named Friedrich Moser, who had celebrated his 21st birthday the previous week by receiving an extra ration of tinned sausages, had intercepted a coded transmission from headquarters. After decryption, the message revealed that a large Allied convoy, designated as Convoy HX-229, was steaming eastward approximately 150 nautical miles to the south. The convoy consisted of 40 merchant vessels, carrying everything from aviation fuel to powdered eggs, escorted by a screen of destroyer escorts and corvettes. Hartenstein had gathered his officers in the cramped wardroom, spreading a chart across the tiny table that also served as their dining surface. The executive officer, Oberleutnant Klaus Dietrich, a meticulous man who kept a small journal in which he recorded every meal consumed aboard the submarine, traced the projected course of the convoy with a pencil stub worn down to barely 2 centimeters in length. "If we proceed at maximum sustainable speed on the surface tonight," Dietrich said, his voice carrying the flat tones of a man stating mathematical certainties, "we can position ourselves directly in the convoy's path by tomorrow morning. They will sail directly into our patrol line." Hartenstein nodded slowly, his mind already calculating the variables. Surface speed at night, when Allied aircraft posed less threat, would allow them to cover the distance efficiently. Then, before dawn, they would submerge and wait. The convoy, blissfully unaware, would pass overhead like sheep walking past a hidden predator. The escort screen, Hartenstein mused, more to himself than to his officers. What do we know? The intelligence officer, a slight man named Brenner, who wore spectacles so thick they made his eyes appear to swim behind the lenses, consulted a small notebook. Based on intercepts, the escort consists of 2 destroyer escorts of the Evarts class, 3 corvettes of the Flower class, and 1 frigate of unknown classification. Standard formation, nothing unusual. Hartenstein allowed himself a thin smile. He had encountered Flower-class corvettes before, brave crews certainly, but their detection equipment was primitive by his estimation. Their sonar systems, which the British called ASTIC, operated on principles that any competent submarine commander could exploit. The sound waves traveled in straight lines through the water, creating predictable shadow zones beneath the thermal layers where temperature differences bent the acoustic energy away from its intended targets. A submarine sitting quietly at the right depth became, for all practical purposes, invisible. "We will approach from the north," Hartenstein announced, his decision crystallizing. Position ourselves beneath the thermal layer and wait. When the convoy passes overhead, we surface behind them, where their escorts cannot see us, and select our targets at leisure. He paused, allowing the plan to settle in the minds of his officers. This convoy is invisible to their primitive detection systems. They will never know we are there until it is far too late. The words hung in the recycled air of the wardroom, accepted by the assembled officers with the confidence born of past success. None of them could have known that 600 miles to the east, in a cramped laboratory in a coastal town in Scotland, a team of engineers had spent the past 14 months developing technology that would render such confidence catastrophically misplaced. The story of what the Allies had developed begins not with military necessity, but with scientific curiosity. In the autumn of 1941, a physicist named Patrick Blackett, who would later receive the Nobel Prize for his work on cosmic rays, had been assigned to analyze the effectiveness of existing submarine detection methods. What he discovered alarmed him profoundly. The existing sonar systems detected submarines at useful ranges only about 20% of the time. The remaining 80% of contacts were either missed entirely or detected too late for effective response. Blackett assembled a team that included mathematicians, physicists, and even a chess grandmaster named Hugh Alexander, who brought to the problem a peculiar ability to think several moves ahead of any opponent. Together, they attacked the detection problem from first principles, questioning every assumption that had guided sonar development since its inception. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A young engineer named John Horton, barely 26 years old and perpetually disheveled in a way that drove his military supervisors to distraction, had been studying the behavior of sound waves in water of varying temperatures. One evening, working late in his laboratory with only a thermos of weak tea for company, he realized that the thermal layers that submarines use to hide could themselves be detected and compensated for. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. By transmitting sonar pulses at multiple frequencies simultaneously and analyzing the subtle differences in their return patterns, an operator could effectively map the thermal structure of the water column. Once the thermal layers were known, mathematical corrections could adjust the sonar beam to penetrate into the shadow zones that had previously provided submarines with sanctuary. The implementation, however, proved enormously challenging. The existing sonar sets lacked the processing capability to handle multiple frequency analysis in real time. The operators, trained for months on systems that behaved in predictable ways, would need to learn entirely new interpretation methods. The manufacturing base that produced sonar equipment was already strained to capacity by the demands of the expanding fleet. Nevertheless, by January of 1943, the first prototype systems had been installed aboard a handful of escort vessels. The results, tested against captured submarines operated by Allied crews, proved remarkable. Detection ranges increased by nearly 300%. The shadow zones that had protected submarines for years became transparent to the new equipment. A submarine commander who believed himself invisible might as well have been carrying a lantern in the darkness. The vessel carrying this revolutionary technology on Convoy HX-229 was the destroyer escort USS Donnell, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Samuel Richardson. Richardson, a former merchant marine officer who had joined the regular forces after the attack on Pearl Harbor, possessed none of the polished manner of career officers. His uniforms never quite fit properly, and he had a habit of chewing on unlit cigars that his wife sent him in monthly care packages. But his crew trusted him absolutely, and his ship consistently performed at the highest levels in every exercise and convoy assignment. The morning of March 20th dawned grey and cold, with a wind out of the northwest that drove spray across the Donnell's Bridge with metronomic regularity. Richardson stood at the chart table, coffee cup in hand, reviewing the overnight reports. The convoy had made good progress through the night, covering nearly 200 nautical miles without incident. Another 4 days of steaming would bring them within range of air cover from Iceland, after which the submarine threat would diminish considerably. Sonar contact, bearing 340, range approximately 4,000 yards. The voice belonged to Sonarman Second Class William Billy Chen, a 22-year-old from San Francisco whose parents ran a laundry in Chinatown. Chen had graduated first in his class from Sonar school, displaying an almost uncanny ability to distinguish between the echoes of submarines and the false returns generated by schools of fish, thermal inversions, and the countless other acoustic phenomena that cluttered the underwater environment. Richardson moved immediately to the sonar station, his coffee forgotten on the chart table. Classification? Chen's face was a study in concentration, his eyes closed as he listened through the headphones with an intensity that seemed to block out everything else in the universe. His fingers made minute adjustments to the receiver controls, tweaking frequencies and gain settings with the delicacy of a surgeon. Definite submarine signature, sir. Diesel electric, estimate depth 90 to 100 meters. He is trying to hide beneath the thermal layer at 75 meters, but the new equipment is painting him clearly. Chen opened his eyes, and Richardson saw something there that might have been wonder. Sir, it is like he is not even trying to hide. I can see him as clearly as if he were on the surface. Richardson turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant James Worthington, a precise young man from Connecticut, who had graduated from Yale with honors in mechanical engineering before the conflict had redirected his career plans. Sound General Quarters. Signal the Convoy Commodore that we have contact and are investigating, and get me a firing solution. Throughout the Donnel, men who had been eating breakfast, sleeping, or maintaining equipment dropped everything and ran to their battle stations. The alarm bells had barely finished their clanging before the ship's crew had transformed from a collection of individuals into a single organism, focused entirely on the task of locating, tracking, and neutralizing the threat beneath them. What followed would later be studied extensively in training programs on both sides of the Atlantic. The engagement lasted approximately 4 hours and 7 minutes, a duration that would have seemed impossibly long to commanders on both sides just 18 months earlier. Previous submarine encounters had typically resolved themselves within minutes, either through quick destruction of the submarine or its successful escape into the depths. This engagement, however, demonstrated an entirely new paradigm of underwater conflict. 90 meters below the surface, Hartenstein received the first indication that something had gone wrong when his sonar operator, a veteran named Schultz, who had been detecting enemy ships since 1939, reported an unusual acoustic pattern. "Captain, I am detecting active sonar transmissions from one of the escorts, but the pattern is strange, multiple frequencies cycling in a way I have not encountered before." Hartenstein moved to the sonar station, his brow furrowed. The sound reaching through the hull was indeed unusual, a warbling tone that rose and fell across a range of frequencies rather than the steady ping of conventional equipment. "Perhaps their equipment is malfunctioning," he suggested, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. "Recommend we go deeper, Captain," Schultz said. "Whatever they are doing, I do not like the sound of it." Hartenstein considered for a moment, then shook his head. "We are already beneath the thermal layer. Any deeper and we risk the pressure hull. No, we stay here and remain quiet. Their equipment, whatever it is doing, cannot penetrate this layer. Physics does not allow it." The conviction in his voice steadied the crew, who had begun to show signs of nervousness. These were experienced men who had survived dozens of depth charge attacks by trusting their captain's judgment. If Hartenstein said they were safe, then they were safe, except they were not. Aboard the Donnel, Chen was tracking the submarine with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Every few minutes, he would call out an updated position, and the plotting team would mark it on their chart. The submarine was moving slowly eastward, clearly attempting to position itself behind the convoy for an attack on the vulnerable merchant vessels. "He thinks he is invisible," Richardson murmured to Worthington, watching the plot develop. "He is sitting right in what should be his best hiding spot, and he has no idea we can see him perfectly." Worthington nodded, his engineering mind appreciating the elegant reversal. "What do you intend to do, sir?" Richardson chewed thoughtfully on his unlit cigar. "We could attack now, but he will hear us coming and might escape. Instead, I want to demonstrate something. I want to show him exactly how visible he actually is." The plan Richardson devised was unusual, but psychologically devastating. Rather than immediately attacking with depth charges, he ordered the Donnel to take up station directly above the submarine and match its course and speed precisely. Then, using the ship's underwater communication system, a device designed primarily for communicating with friendly submarines, he transmitted a message. "Attention submarine below us. We have you on continuous sonar contact at depth 92 meters, bearing 275 from our position, speed 4 knots. We can track you anywhere you go. Surface immediately and prepare to be boarded, or we will prosecute with depth charges. You have 15 minutes to comply." The message, transmitted in German, reached Hartenstein's submarine with startling clarity. The effect on the crew was immediate and profound. Men who moments before had felt secure in their invisible sanctuary now understood that they had been observed the entire time, their every movement tracked with impossible precision. "They are lying," Hartenstein said, but his voice had lost its previous conviction. "They cannot possibly know our exact depth and bearing. They are making educated guesses, trying to frighten us into revealing ourselves." Schultz, the sonar operator, spoke quietly. "Captain, that sonar pattern, I have been listening to it carefully. It is not random. It is scanning multiple layers simultaneously. I think they actually can see us." The next 15 minutes stretched into an eternity. Hartenstein paced the control room, considering his options. He could attempt to go deeper, but the pressure hull was already groaning slightly at their current depth. He could try to run, but the escort above them would simply follow. He could attempt a torpedo attack, surfacing long enough to fire. But the element of surprise, his greatest weapon, had been completely neutralized. "Captain," the radio operator called out, "I am intercepting transmissions between the escort vessels. They are coordinating a pattern search around our position. They are not guessing, they know exactly where we are." Hartenstein closed his eyes, a great weariness settling over him. In that moment, he understood that everything he had believed about submarine tactics had become obsolete. The technology that had made submarines the terror of the Atlantic had been countered by new technology, and he had sailed into this engagement as ignorant of this development as a knight charging a machine gun. The decision, when it came, was not difficult so much as inevitable. "Prepare to surface," he ordered quietly. "We will comply with their demands." The emergence of the submarine from the depths, its sleek grey form breaking through the wave tops into the cold Atlantic air, marked more than the conclusion of a single engagement. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of undersea conflict. The submarine, which had seemed virtually invincible in the opening years of the war, had been revealed as vulnerable in ways its commanders had never anticipated. What followed the surfacing was, by the standards of naval conflict, remarkably civilized. Richardson brought the Donnell alongside the submarine, close enough that the two crews could see each other's faces across the narrow gap of churning water. A boarding party, led by Lieutenant Worthington, crossed to the submarine via a line-throwing apparatus and accepted the formal surrender of Hartenstein and his crew. The 44 men of the submarine's crew were taken aboard the Donnell as prisoners. They were given dry clothing, hot food, and medical attention for those who needed it. Hartenstein, as senior officer, was granted the courtesy of a private cabin, though under guard. The submarine itself, too valuable to simply sink, was taken under tow by another escort vessel and eventually reached port, where Allied technical experts spent months studying every aspect of its design and capabilities. Among the prisoners was the young radio operator Friedrich Moser, who had received those tin sausages for his birthday just days earlier. He found himself sharing accommodations with several American sailors, not much older than himself, young men who had joined their navy for reasons not so different from his own. In the cramped quarters of the destroyer escort, enemies who had been trying to eliminate each other hours before discovered their common humanity. One evening, about 3 days after the surrender, Moser found himself in conversation with Sonarman Chen, the operator whose skill with the new equipment had made the capture possible. Through a mixture of broken English, hand gestures, and the universal language of young men far from home, they managed to communicate. "Your equipment," Moser said, struggling with the English words. "It is very good. We did not know." Chen nodded, understanding the question behind the statement. "New technology," he explained. "Just installed a few months ago. Before that, you would have been invisible to us." Moser absorbed this information with visible relief. It had not been a failure of skill or courage that had doomed his submarine, but simply the relentless advance of technology. There was comfort in that somehow. The convoy reached its destination without further incident. The 40 merchant vessels delivered their cargoes of fuel, food, and equipment to ports throughout Britain, their holds containing enough supplies to sustain the war effort for another precious few weeks. The loss of a single submarine, while significant, mattered less than the larger pattern that this engagement represented. In the months that followed, the new sonar technology was installed on escort vessels throughout the Allied fleets. The improvement in detection rates was dramatic and immediate. Submarines that had operated with impunity for years found themselves being tracked, attacked, and neutralized at rates that shattered the previous statistical models. The commanders of the submarine fleet, receiving reports of loss after loss, struggled to understand what had changed. Hartenstein spent the remainder of the conflict as a prisoner. He was held initially in Britain, then transferred to a camp in Canada, where the wide open spaces and pine forests bore no resemblance to the cramped steel cylinder that had been his home for so many years. In captivity, he had time to reflect on the engagement that had ended his active service. In his later writings, produced after the conflict ended and he returned to civilian life, Hartenstein described the moment of realization that his submarine had been tracked through the thermal layer as the most significant educational experience of his career. "We had become too confident in our understanding of the ocean," he wrote. "We believed that physics was on our side, that certain principles could not be overcome. We failed to anticipate that our enemies might find ways to change the rules entirely." The broader implications of the engagement extended far beyond the fate of one submarine and its crew. The success of the new detection systems led to accelerated research and development programs on both sides. Within a year, submarines were being designed with new hull coatings intended to absorb sonar energy, while the Allies were developing even more sophisticated detection methods. The technological competition that had begun with this engagement would continue long after the conflict ended, shaping naval doctrine for generations. For the crews of Convoy HX-229, the engagement became one story among many in the long chronicle of the Atlantic crossing. The merchant sailors, who had spent years living with the constant threat of submarine attack, noted the change in atmosphere as word spread of the successful detection and capture. The ocean had not become safe, but it had become somewhat less dangerous, and that modest improvement in their odds of survival was worth celebrating. The Donnell continued its escort duties for the remainder of the conflict, participating in numerous convoy operations and several more submarine encounters. Richardson was eventually promoted and given command of a larger vessel, though he always spoke of his time aboard the destroyer escort with particular fondness. The crew he had led during the Hartenstein engagement remained, in his estimation, the finest group of sailors he had ever served with. Chen, the young sonarman, whose skill had made the capture possible, completed his naval service and returned to San Francisco after the conflict ended. He used his technical training to establish an electronics repair business that eventually grew into a successful enterprise. His parents' laundry, which had supported the family through difficult years, was converted into the first location of what would become a small chain of electronics stores. The new sonar technology that had played such a crucial role in this engagement continued to evolve throughout the decades that followed. The basic principle, using multiple frequencies to penetrate thermal layers and eliminate acoustic shadow zones, remains fundamental to modern submarine detection systems. Every sonar operator trained today learns techniques that trace their lineage directly to the innovations developed in that Scottish laboratory during the darkest years of the Atlantic conflict. The story of Hartenstein's capture illustrates a larger truth about technological conflict. Superiority is always temporary. The submarine, which had seemed to represent an insurmountable threat, was countered by detection technology. That detection technology would eventually be countered by quieter submarines and better countermeasures. The cycle continues to this day, an endless chess match between those who wish to hide and those who wish to find. Perhaps most significantly, this engagement demonstrated the importance of what military theorists would later call the innovation cycle. The side that could develop, test, and deploy new technologies most rapidly held a decisive advantage. The ability to surprise an enemy with capabilities they did not know existed proved more valuable than any number of traditional military assets. For the 44 men captured aboard Hartenstein's submarine, the end of their active participation in the conflict came not with destruction, but with surrender and eventual repatriation. They returned to a homeland profoundly changed by defeat, carrying with them memories of years spent in the steel confines of submarine hulls, breathing recycled air and waiting for the depth charges that might end their lives at any moment. The experience marked them in ways that peaceful civilian life could never entirely erase. The engagement between the Donnell and Hartenstein submarine lasted, as noted, approximately 4 hours and 7 minutes. In that time, the fundamental assumptions underlying submarine tactics were invalidated. A confident commander was forced to acknowledge the limits of his knowledge, and the balance of technological advantage shifted in ways that would influence the outcome of the conflict. It was not a dramatic battle in the traditional sense, with explosions and heroic charges and decisive moments of courage. It was instead something more modern, a contest of systems, of technologies, of organizational capabilities. In the end, what determined the outcome was not the bravery of the crews, though both displayed considerable courage, nor the skill of the commanders, though both were experienced professionals. What determined the outcome was the ability of one side to develop and deploy new technology faster than the other side could adapt. This lesson, learned in the cold waters of the North Atlantic in March of 1943, remains relevant to military planners and strategic theorists to this day. The thermal layer that Hartenstein had trusted to hide his submarine still exists in the North Atlantic, still bends sound waves in the same predictable patterns it always has. Ships and submarines still navigate through those waters, equipped with technologies that would seem magical to the sailors of 1943. The fundamental challenge, detecting objects hidden in the vast opacity of the ocean depths, remains as difficult as ever. But the confidence that led Hartenstein to boast that his convoy was invisible, that certainty in the permanence of technological advantage, serves as a cautionary tale. In the constant evolution of military technology, invisibility is always temporary, and the hunter can become the hunted with the deployment of a single new system. The waters where this engagement took place show no trace of the events that occurred there nearly a century ago. The Atlantic swells rise and fall with the same rhythms that have persisted since the ocean first formed. Merchant vessels still cross those waters, carrying goods between continents, their voyages unremarkable and safe in ways that would have astonished the sailors of wartime convoys. Somewhere in the depths below, at positions known only to military archivists and oceanographic researchers, rest the remains of submarines that were not as fortunate as Hartenstein's vessel. Their crews, unlike the 44 men who surrendered that March day, never had the opportunity to become prisoners, to survive the conflict, to return home and rebuild their lives. The difference between survival and destruction often came down to factors as arbitrary as which convoy attracted which escort vessel, which commander made which decision at which critical moment. The story of Hartenstein's capture is in many ways a story of survival against odds, not the dramatic survival of combat heroes or resistance fighters, but the quieter survival of men who recognized when the situation had become impossible and chose surrender over destruction. In the calculus of conflict, that choice allowed 44 men to eventually return to their families, to contribute to the rebuilding of their country, to live out their natural lives. Richardson, the American commander whose tactical patience and psychological insight had produced the surrender, never spoke of the engagement as a personal triumph. In his view, the technology had done the work. He had merely deployed it effectively. This modesty, characteristic of the man, perhaps understated his contribution. Technology, however sophisticated, requires skilled operators and wise commanders to achieve its potential. The new sonar system, in the hands of a less capable crew, might have produced different results. The intersection of human skill and technological capability defines the character of modern conflict. Neither alone is sufficient. Both together create decisive advantages. This truth, demonstrated so clearly in the cold waters of the North Atlantic in 1943, continues to shape military thinking and planning across all domains of potential conflict. As the years passed and the veterans of the Atlantic conflict grew old and eventually passed away, the specific details of engagements like this one faded from popular memory. The broader outlines remained, the general awareness that submarines had posed a threat and that threat had been overcome. But the human stories, the individual experiences of men like Hartenstein and Richardson and Chen and Moser, became historical footnotes, preserved in archives and academic studies, but largely unknown to general audiences. Perhaps that is as it should be. The men who served in that conflict did not do so seeking glory or recognition. They served because their countries called them to serve, because they believed in causes larger than themselves, because the circumstances of history placed them in positions where service was required. The recognition that truly mattered to them was far simpler, the knowledge that they had done their duty, that they had served with honor, that they had survived to see the end. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.